Not a long one. Not the kind you sit in for 10 minutes on a busy Friday afternoon and complain about on the drive home. A real line. The kind that stretches around the block and down the street and past the next intersection and keeps going. The kind where people turn their engines off because they know they are going to be there for hours. The kind where drivers film it on their phones because even they cannot quite believe what they are looking at. Now picture that gas station. In Russia, the country that sits on one of the largest oil reserves on the planet, the country that pumps more crude out of the ground than almost any other nation on Earth, the second largest crude exporter in the entire world. That country, those drivers, that line. And while those Russians are standing in that line, filming empty pumps on their phones, wondering when the fuel is going to arrive, Ukraine just hit oil infrastructure in St. Petersburg, the city Vladimir Putin was born in. The city he has spent his entire political career treating as untouchable. Black smoke rising off a port on the Gulf of Finland on the 4th of July 2026, while fireworks light up the sky over Washington 5,000 miles away. That is not a coincidence. That is a strategy. And tonight, we are going to walk through exactly how it is working. Section 1. The honest truth, 0:45 to 3:30. The country sitting on an ocean of oil is rationing gasoline. Here are the numbers. Let us start with the number that stopped me when I first looked at it, because it is the kind of number that does not make sense until you sit with it long enough to understand what it is actually describing. Russia is currently producing roughly 85,000 metric tons of gasoline every single day. That sounds like a lot, and in absolute terms, it is a lot. But peak summer demand inside Russia runs close to 110,000 metric tons per day, which means that right now, in the summer of 2026, Russia is running a daily fuel shortfall of approximately 25,000 metric tons every single day. Not as a one-time crisis, not as a temporary disruption that gets fixed in a week, as a structural gap between what Russia can produce and what Russia actually needs. Now translate that gap into human terms, because metric tons are easy to look past and human terms are not. 25,000 metric tons per day is empty pumps. It is rationing. It is regional fuel authorities telling drivers that supplies are limited and that they should plan accordingly. As of late June 2026, at least 55 of Russia's 83 regions were reporting some form of fuel shortage. Not all of them were severe. Not all of them had lines stretching around the block. But 55 out of 83 regions reporting any kind of shortage in a country that produces as much crude oil as Russia produces is not a logistics hiccup. It is a systemic failure, and the difference between a logistics hiccup and a systemic failure is the difference between a problem that gets solved next month and a problem that gets worse the longer the conditions creating it stay in place. The conditions creating it are not going away. But before we get into what is causing this and what Ukraine has to do with it, let us deal with the part that makes this story genuinely strange. Because the production number and the demand number together do not fully explain the shortage. Russia is not just producing less fuel than it needs. Russia is also quietly doing something that no major oil exporting country wants to admit it is doing. It is buying fuel from its neighbors. Not loudly, not through official announcements that end up on the front page of state media, quietly. Through arrangements and agreements that reflect the gap between what Russia can tell its people about its energy situation and what Russia actually needs to do to keep its economy and its military functioning at the same time. Think about what that image looks like from the outside for a moment. The second largest crude exporter on Earth. A country whose entire economic identity for the last 3 decades has been built around the idea that it sits on so much oil and gas that it can use energy as a weapon, as a diplomatic tool, as a source of leverage over its neighbors and trading partners. That country is now on the other side of that transaction. That country is now the one making quiet calls to neighbors, asking if they have spare fuel capacity they would be willing to sell. That is not a war story. That is an economic story. And it is one of the most revealing economic stories to come out of this conflict because it tells you something about the internal pressure building inside Russia that the battlefield maps do not show, and that Russian state media will never report honestly. Now let us be precise about what is driving this, because precision is the only thing that separates analysis from noise in a story this saturated with claims from every direction. Russia's fuel shortage in 2026 has 2 engines running at the same time, and both of them need to be understood separately before you can understand what they look like together. The first engine is the war itself. Russia's military operation in Ukraine consumes fuel at a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend from the outside. Tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, supply trucks, generators, field equipment, all of it runs on fuel. All of it competes with the civilian economy for the same supply that Russia's refineries are producing every day. In peacetime, that competition does not exist in any meaningful way because production comfortably covers both military and civilian needs with room to spare. In a war that has been running for over 4 years and that shows no sign of ending quickly, that competition is real and it is daily and it is getting more acute as the military's needs stay high, and the refinery capacity available to meet those needs gets smaller. Which brings us to the second engine. Ukraine figured out that the smartest target in Russia is not a tank, it is a refinery. And that realization and the drone campaign that followed from it is the part of this story that the fuel shortage numbers are only beginning to describe. Ukraine did not go after Russia's army. It went after Russia's ability to feed one. Forget the tank for a second. Every conversation about this war eventually comes back to tanks. How many Russia has? How many Ukraine has destroyed? How many are sitting in depots waiting to be repaired? How many are moving toward the front line on any given morning? Tanks are the visual shorthand for military power in a land war, and that is understandable because they are large and loud and dramatic and they photograph well. But a tank without fuel is not a weapon. It is an expensive metal box sitting in a field. And sometime in 2024, the people running Ukraine's drone program looked at a map of Russian oil infrastructure and understood something that changed the entire logic of what they were trying to accomplish. You do not need to destroy Russia's army to stop Russia's army. You need to destroy Russia's ability to keep its army moving. And the thing that keeps an army moving, the thing that every tank and every truck and every armored vehicle and every aircraft and every generator at every forward operating base absolutely cannot function without, is refined fuel. Not crude oil sitting in the ground. Refined fuel, the processed product that comes out of a refinery after the crude has been heated and treated and turned into something an engine can actually use. That is the thing that runs the war. And refineries, it turns out, are very large, very complex, very difficult to protect, and very easy to damage with the right kind of drone if you know exactly where to aim. Ukraine knew exactly where to aim. The campaign that Ukraine has been running against Russian oil refineries and fuel storage facilities is not something that started overnight. It has been building since late 2023, and it accelerated significantly through 2024 and into 2025 as Ukraine's long-range drone capability improved and as the targeting intelligence feeding those drones got sharper and more precise. The results of that campaign are now sitting inside the production numbers we just walked through in the previous section. The 85,000 metric ton daily production figure that falls 25,000 tons short of what Russia needs every single day is not just a function of wartime demand pressure. It is a function of refinery capacity that has been systematically reduced by a drone campaign that Russia has not been able to stop. Let us talk about what that looks like on the ground because the scale of it is genuinely remarkable. Russian refineries have been hit repeatedly across multiple regions. The facilities at Saratov, Ryazan, Nizhny Novgorod, and multiple sites in southern Russia have all taken strike damage at various points in the campaign. Each hit does not necessarily destroy a refinery completely. That is not the point. The point is to damage the specific components that are hardest and most expensive to repair. The distillation columns, the catalytic crackers, the processing units that take crude in and push refined product out. When those components get damaged, they do not get fixed in a week. They get fixed in months if the replacement parts are available, and in longer than that if they are not. And under Western sanctions that have been cutting Russia off from the specialized industrial equipment it needs to maintain complex petrochemical infrastructure, the replacement parts are increasingly not available on any reasonable timeline. So each strike compounds the previous one. Each damaged refinery that cannot be fully repaired before the next strike arrives represents a permanent reduction in Russia's daily fuel output that does not recover cleanly even when the immediate damage is patched over. The cumulative effect of 2 years of this campaign is the 25,000-ton daily shortfall that is putting Russians in line at gas stations across 55 of the country's 83 regions right now in the summer of 2026. Now add the St. Petersburg strike because it belongs in a separate category from everything else in this campaign. On the 4th of July, 2026, Ukraine hit oil infrastructure in St. Petersburg and struck a military target in nearby Kronstadt. Zelensky confirmed it himself on Telegram. And the significance of that strike goes beyond the physical damage it caused, which was real, and which sent black smoke rising over the Gulf of Finland in images that traveled around the world within hours. St. Petersburg is not just a city, it is the city Vladimir Putin was born in, the city he grew up in. The city whose cultural and political identity is more personally connected to the man running this war than any other place on the Russian map. Putin has spent his entire career treating St. Petersburg as a place that exists above the reach of the conflict he started. a place whose skyline does not carry the marks of a war being fought in his name hundreds of miles to the south and west, a place whose residents can look at the news from Ukraine and feel the comfortable distance of geography between themselves and the consequences of decisions made in the Kremlin. That distance closed on July 4th, and the choice of date was not accidental either. Ukraine has demonstrated repeatedly throughout this war a sharp awareness of the symbolic weight of timing. Striking Putin's hometown on American Independence Day while Washington was lighting up the largest fireworks display it had ever attempted was a message aimed at multiple audiences simultaneously. It was aimed at the Russian public, it was aimed at the Kremlin, and it was aimed at the international audience watching to see whether Ukraine still had the capability and the will to take the fight to places Russia considered safe. The answer that came back from St. Petersburg was yes on all three counts. Now talk about Kronstadt, because that target deserves its own attention. Kronstadt is a naval fortress island sitting in the Gulf of Finland, just west of St. Petersburg. It has been a military installation since the time of Peter the Great. It houses Russian Baltic Fleet assets and military infrastructure that connects directly to Russia's naval presence in the Baltic Sea. Hitting Kronstadt is not hitting a fuel depot in a provincial city. It is hitting a military installation with centuries of strategic significance in a location that sits at the western gateway to St. Petersburg itself. The message that sends inside Russian military planning circles is different from the message that a strike on a refinery in Saratov sends. It says that Ukraine's reach is not limited to soft infrastructure targets in distant regions. It says that the military assets Russia uses to project power in the Baltic are within range and within targeting capability. That is the kind of message that changes planning assumptions. But here is the part that ties all of this together into the single most important insight of this entire story. Ukraine is not winning this campaign because its drones are so sophisticated that Russia cannot defend against them. Russia has air defense. Russia has radar. Russia has interception capability that has improved significantly since the early days of the drone campaign. Ukraine is winning this campaign because the math of attack versus defense in drone warfare fundamentally favors the attacker when the attacker has enough drones and enough targeting intelligence to keep the pressure continuous. Russia cannot protect every refinery, every fuel depot, every pipeline junction, every storage facility, and every military fuel installation across a country that spans 11 time zones simultaneously. It cannot be everywhere. And Ukraine does not need to be everywhere either. Ukraine only needs to keep finding the gaps in the coverage, keep sending drones through those gaps, and keep adding to the cumulative damage that is showing up in the production numbers in the regional shortage reports and in the lines at Russian gas stations that are getting longer and not shorter as this summer progresses. Ukraine did not shut down Russia's army. It shut down Russia's ability to fuel one, and the difference between those two things is the difference between a battle and a strategy. Russia is fighting two wars at the same time and losing one of them quietly. There is a war everybody is watching, and there is a war nobody is talking about. The war everybody is watching has front lines and maps and daily updates and satellite images and casualty figures and territorial gains measured in kilometers that get debated on every news channel from London to Tokyo. That war is real and it matters, and it is not going anywhere anytime soon. But there is another war running underneath that one, a war without a front line, a war without a map that updates every morning, a war being fought on spreadsheets and balance sheets and fuel production reports and regional shortage statistics that most journalists skip past because they do not photograph as well as a burning tank. That second war is the one Russia is quietly losing. And the fuel shortage that we have been walking through tonight is not just a symptom of that second war, it is the clearest window into it that we have had since this conflict began. Because when you understand what an empty pump in a Russian city actually represents, when you follow the chain of cause and effect all the way back to its origin, you end up looking at something that goes much deeper than a logistics problem, or a refinery fire, or a drone strike on a fuel depot. You end up looking at the structural collapse of the economic model that was supposed to make this war survivable for Russia indefinitely. Let us walk through what that actually means. Start with the military dimension because it is the most immediate and the most direct connection between the fuel shortage numbers and the situation on the ground in Ukraine right now. Russia's military operation requires fuel in quantities that the Western press has consistently underestimated throughout this conflict. The assumption in many early analyses was that Russia's vast oil wealth would insulate it from any kind of energy-based pressure, that the country producing that much crude could simply redirect as much refined product as its military needed and absorb whatever civilian shortfall resulted without any serious political or operational consequence. That assumption has been tested by 4 years of war, and it has not held up. Here is why. Russia cannot simply redirect unlimited refined fuel to its military without consequences, because refined fuel and crude oil are not the same thing. Russia has plenty of crude. The crude is in the ground and the pipelines are moving it. What Russia does not have enough of right now is refinery capacity to turn that crude into the specific refined products its military actually uses. Military vehicles do not run on crude oil. They run on diesel. They run on aviation fuel. They run on the specific refined products that come out of the processing units that Ukraine has been systematically damaging for the past 2 years. So the shortage is not about how much oil Russia has in the ground. It is about how much of that oil Russia can actually process into usable fuel at the rate the war demands. And that processing capacity has been reduced by the drone campaign in ways that cannot be quickly reversed even if Ukraine stopped flying tomorrow, which Ukraine is not going to do. The consequence for Russian military operations is something that frontline reporting has been picking up on for months, but that has not fully made it into the mainstream analysis of how this war is going. Russian armored units in the Zaporizhzhia direction have been reporting fuel rationing at the unit level, not dramatic shortages that ground entire formations. Rationing, the kind of careful management of available fuel that changes how a unit operates without stopping it entirely. Vehicles that would normally run patrol routes are being kept stationary to conserve fuel. Resupply runs that would normally happen daily are being consolidated into less frequent trips. Aviation sorties that would normally be flown in support of ground operations are being prioritized more carefully because the fuel cost of each sortie now has to be weighed against the operational benefit in a way it did not have to be weighed a year ago. None of this stops the Russian military from functioning, but all of it makes it function worse than it otherwise would. And in a war where the margin between advancing and stalling is already razor thin across most of the front line, functioning worse than you otherwise would is not a small thing. It is the difference between a push that succeeds and a push that runs out of momentum 3 kilometers short of where it needed to reach. Now move to the economic dimension, because this is where the story gets bigger than the battlefield. Russia's entire strategic calculation at the start of this war was built on a specific assumption about its own economic resilience. The assumption was that oil revenue would keep flowing, that sanctions would hurt but not cripple, and that the combination of energy wealth and economic endurance would allow Russia to outlast Western support for Ukraine. Putin said as much in various forms throughout 2022 and 2023. The West would get tired, the money would stop, Ukraine would have to negotiate from weakness. Russia just had to keep the economic engine running long enough for that political exhaustion to arrive. The fuel shortage is a direct attack on that assumption, because here is what the shortage is doing to Russia's balance sheet in ways that go beyond the visible lines at gas stations. Russia exports crude oil. That is where the revenue comes from. But Russia also needs refined products domestically to keep its economy and its military running. When refinery capacity gets damaged, Russia faces a choice it did not expect to face. It can export less crude in order to keep more of it available for domestic refining. Or it can maintain export volumes and deal with the domestic shortage by importing refined products from neighbors. Either choice costs money. Either choice represents a drain on the revenue that was supposed to make this war economically sustainable indefinitely. The numbers reflecting that drain are not being published by the Russian government in any transparent way, but they are showing up in the regional shortage reports. They are showing up in the quiet fuel purchase arrangements with neighboring countries. And they are showing up in the gap between what Russian state media says about the country's economic resilience and what Russian drivers experience every time they pull into a gas station and find the pumps running dry. Now think about what Putin's hopes for 2026 actually were coming into this year. The hope was consolidation. After the grinding advances of 2024 and 2025, the hope was that 2026 would be the year the economic pressure on Ukraine and its Western supporters reached a tipping point, that military aid packages would get harder to pass through Western parliaments, that public support for the war in Europe and America would soften enough to create political space for a negotiated settlement on terms favorable to Moscow, that Russia's economic model would hold together long enough for that political window to open. Ukraine's answer to that hope has been precise and deliberate. It has been a drone flying toward a refinery. It has been black smoke over St. Petersburg on the 4th of July. It has been 25,000 metric tons of daily fuel shortfall showing up in 55 Russian regions simultaneously. It has been the quiet humiliation of the world's second largest crude exporter making phone calls to its neighbors asking to buy fuel. Every one of those things is a direct attack on the assumption that Russia can outlast this war economically. Every refinery that cannot be repaired on schedule is a reduction in the revenue and the operational capacity that Putin's 2026 strategy depends on. Every region reporting empty pumps is a piece of domestic political pressure that the Kremlin has to manage while simultaneously managing a war, a sanctions regime, a military recruitment crisis, and an international isolation that shows no sign of reversing. Russia is not collapsing tonight, but Russia is running 2 wars simultaneously and paying the full cost of both. the war on the front line in Ukraine, and the war on its own balance sheet that Ukraine is winning one refinery at a time. The empty pump is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of the reckoning. Come back to that gas station line, the one we started with, the one stretching around the block in a country that sits on one of the largest oil reserves on Earth, the one where Russian drivers are turning their engines off because they know they are going to be waiting for hours. The one where people are filming it on their phones, not because they want to post it somewhere, but because they cannot quite believe they are standing in it. That line is not a random inconvenience. That line is the physical, visible, undeniable result of every decision made in the Kremlin since February of 2022, catching up with the Russian economy in a way that state media cannot explain away and that government statistics cannot hide. It is the drone campaign that Ukraine has been running against Russian refineries for 2 years, showing up not as a headline about a distant fire, but as a personal, daily, impossible-to-ignore inconvenience for ordinary Russian citizens who had nothing to do with starting this war and who now cannot fill their tank on a Tuesday morning. That is what a strategy looks like when it works. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not the kind of thing that makes the highlight reel, just a line at a gas station that keeps getting longer. Here is where the 3 scenarios that determine what happens next in this story actually live. Because a fuel shortage of this scale in a country at war does not resolve itself quietly, and it does not stay contained to the economic column of the analysis. It bleeds into everything. Into military operations, into domestic politics, into the negotiating position that Russia carries into any future conversation about how this war ends. And the direction it bleeds depends on which of 3 paths the next phase of this conflict takes. The first path is the one Ukraine is actively trying to force. The shortage deepens. The drone campaign against refinery infrastructure continues at the pace it has been running and accelerates where new targeting intelligence opens new opportunities. The daily shortfall of 25,000 metric tons grows rather than shrinks as additional refinery capacity gets taken offline faster than damaged capacity can be restored. The 55 regions reporting shortages become 60 and then 65, and then a number that the Russian government can no longer manage through quiet regional rationing without the pressure becoming visible at a national political level. Military fuel rationing that is currently happening at the unit level starts happening at the formation level. Pushes that were already running on thin margins run out of momentum earlier and more consistently. And the economic model that was supposed to make this war sustainable indefinitely starts showing cracks that even the most disciplined state media management cannot fully paper over. This path does not end the war by itself, but it changes the terms on which the war continues in ways that favor Ukraine's position at any future negotiating table. The second path is the one Russian military planners are working on right now and have been working on since the drone campaign began to bite in a serious way. Russia adapts. It disperses refinery operations to make individual facilities harder to target completely. It accelerates the development of domestic air defense coverage around critical fuel infrastructure. It diversifies its refined product import arrangements with countries that are willing to sell fuel to Russia regardless of what Western governments think about that transaction. It finds workarounds for the sanctions, cutting it off from the replacement parts its refineries need, and it patches damaged facilities with whatever domestic alternatives are available, even if those alternatives are less efficient than the original components. None of these adaptations are impossible. Russia is not without resources or ingenuity when its back is against the wall, but each adaptation costs money. Each workaround is less efficient than the system it is replacing. Each patch job on a damaged refinery produces less refined product than the original facility did before it was hit. And the cumulative cost of adapting to a drone campaign that does not stop is a drag on Russian economic and military performance that compounds over time, even if it never produces a single dramatic moment of collapse. The third path is the one that makes everyone uncomfortable because it involves Russia doing something unpredictable in response to pressure it cannot manage through normal channels. History suggests that when authoritarian governments face economic pressure that threatens their domestic political stability, they do not always respond by moderating their behavior. Sometimes they escalate. Sometimes they do something designed to change the subject, to create a new crisis that redirects public attention away from the internal problem and toward an external threat that can be used to justify continued sacrifice and continued control. Russia has used this playbook before. The question that nobody can answer with certainty right now is whether the fuel shortage and the broader economic pressure building on Russia in the summer of 2026 is close enough to a domestic political tipping point to trigger that kind of escalatory response, or whether it is uncomfortable enough to bite but not severe enough yet to push the decision-making in the Kremlin toward something that carries its own enormous risks. That question does not have a clean answer tonight. But it is the question that the empty pump is asking. Come back one final time to St. Petersburg, the city Putin was born in, the city he treated as untouchable, the city where black smoke rose over the Gulf of Finland on the 4th of July 2026, while fireworks lit up the sky over Washington, and while Russian drivers stood in lines at gas stations across 55 regions filming what they were seeing on their phones because it did not look like the version of Russia that state television had been selling them for the past 4 years. Ukraine did not win the war on July 4th. It did not take back territory. It did not collapse the Russian military. It did not end the fuel shortage with a single strike or change the map in any way that will show up in the daily update that analysts publish every morning. What Ukraine did was something harder to measure and more important in the long run. It sent smoke into the sky above the city that was supposed to be safe. It put a line at a gas station in a country that was supposed to have unlimited fuel. It turned the assumption that Russia could outlast this war economically into a question that 55 regions worth of empty pumps are now answering every single day. Russia came into 2026 with hopes. Hopes that the West would get tired, that the money would stop, that Ukraine would run out of options before Russia ran out of time. Ukraine's answer to those hopes has been precise and patient and relentless. One refinery at a time, one drone at a time, one empty pump at a time, and the line at that gas station in Russia is not getting shorter.